9th. And the first order of business is approval of the minutes for August 12th and the continuation on August 19th.
I think we need to call the roll for attendees to make sure that it's official.
You, Penny, and I are all here. Okay, do you want to call the roll, Terry?
Yep.
I don't think we've ever done that before, but.
Have we not? Yeah, sorry, I'm getting kind of confused with other meetings.
We do that in the Plan Commission, but not much of any other meeting. So I think with a quorum, we can go ahead and get started. So I need a motion for the minutes.
Move approval of the minutes of August 12th and continuation from August 19th.
I second that.
All right. Are there any comments or questions, discussion?
Just another thank you for taking those minutes. There's a lot of discussion, which just makes the minutes a little more work heavy, if you will.
It sure does. And they were very well done. Thank you, Connie. All right, Terry.
Lee.
Yes.
We need to give Donna the credit for that. She's the one that worked hard on the minutes.
Excuse me.
We doubled her work this month.
Yeah, definitely. And Connie sent them, so I just kind of assumed she had done it. But no, thank you, Donna, very much. Okay, I think we're ready for a vote. Terry, would you like to call the roll? You're muted.
Lee Jones?
Yes.
Penny Griffin?
Yes.
Githens? And Tron Enright. Sorry about that, Penny.
Yes.
I've been called much worse, Terry.
Okay, motion passes. Yeah. And the next thing on our agenda is a stormwater expenditure report. Terry?
Looking at the summary report, the office supplies and materials, the top portion of the page there, all in line. Backfill material, it's about what we spend every month. Training and travel, Connie signed up for the NAFSM conference. I think that's a virtual conference, but we're signed up for it. The on-call services is 140. That's for the BMP that was required out at the garage. And as I told you previously, that's the first invoice. We've received the final invoice and retainage. We've approved the final invoice and we're holding on the retainage until we get some vegetation started. So that project's pretty well finished up also. Disposal fees, $100 for some fill dirt. It looks like we brought down on the site down on Cherry Lane. We went in and did a little finish work on that. Cartograph license, 625 was for a partial year earlier on. Professional fees, I think I made a phone call with Siavash for that. Lake Monroe water quality, the South Fork stream gauge. I've explained this once, but I'll go through it again just so that everybody follows it. We have an agreement with the Department of Interior, USGS, for $18,500 to be invoiced by December of 2021. And they've invoiced us for half of that, for the $92.50. So between now and December, end of 2021, they will be invoicing us for the rest of it. And that's for this, to assist in the South Fork Salt Creek Stream Gate. Baby Creek moving down, that's, that invoice is for right-of-way. We're getting into right-of-way purchases there and appraisals, and it's underway. I haven't heard any troubles on it, but I don't, if there's any questions, specific questions on it, just let me know. Then we get down in the contracts. Baby Creek is down there at 337, and you can see it's built out about 3/4 of the way. Stip Road. This one just keeps sitting here, and I'm as discouraged as I'm sure you guys are wanting to ask me about it. It's with the Corps of Engineers waiting for their sign off on it. Everything on our end is done other than getting that permit from them. So if there are any questions there, let me know. And then the Monroe County Garage again is the contract for that BMP that I was telling you about earlier, and it's pretty well closed out now. The high year to date, this question came up before, and that is the 232 is what we had budgeted, but it does not reflect some encumbered funds that I pulled over from 2019 that I used for the dump truck and some of these design jobs. As I think about it, it's probably the most realistic picture would be to change the 232 to include those encumbered quantities or those encumbered amounts. Is there any input on that or any suggestions, any ideas?
Sounds like a good idea. I'm sure it'll bring a little more clarity to the document, and we won't have Jim asking us every month. Is he on the call? I can't have fun at his suspense if he's not here, but I definitely think adding that will definitely bring in clarity. Encumbrance is always a tricky thing.
It's really not in a budgeted amount, but
right. But then it kind of goes to your year to date and everything.
Right.
Hey, Terry, can you talk to Ginger? Because the encumbered, yeah, it's a lot different and it's a contract amount, but your expenditure report is basically what you're spending each month. Maybe we could have Ginger modify how the percentages are coming out instead of it, because I agree with Tron. It looks like we've spent 94% of our budget, but it's not reflecting it all. But if we could just get that amount to reflect maybe what we're actually spending, maybe modify it that way. We can talk to Ginger about it.
I'll get with her and see what I can come up with and bring back an idea next month. So,
Okay.
excuse me. So that's all I got there.
I just echo, as you're working with Ginger, Kim Shell in the auditor's office, I'm sure she might have a formula that you could just feed into your Excel that would help with the situation. So I just wanted to echo the auditor's office and Kim Shell. She's very equipped with handling these situations. So
Thank you.
This is Lee Flory. I've got a citizen question for you because I am a resident at the very end of Baby Creek, and I've been wondering what's going on out there for about 2 years now. So I don't, if you all can, and I don't want to really delay anything, just like a 20-second, like what's the timetable on that? That's really all I was curious about.
Terry,
You want me to touch on it?
Sure.
Yeah, Terry.
The design is complete. We're in the process of buying right of way for the improvements. And at this point, I'm working with Lisa and other sources to come up with alternatives in the way we're going to finance it, and looking at alternatives of the whole thing, or maybe the worst crossing or a couple crossings. We're looking at those alternates, Lee.
Okay, thank you very much. Just curious where we're at. You know, those creek crossings are a challenge sometimes, as you know.
I know they are.
Is there any other discussion or questions from the board?
No.
Is there any other public comment? Seeing none, we'll come back for a vote. Terry, would you please call the roll?
Lee Jones,
Yes.
Penny Givens,
Yes.
Tron Enright.
Yes.
Okay.
All
Lee,
right.
if I may, I would like to say that
Yes.
Maggie and I had an opportunity to meet a few months back, and she's expressed an interest to come in and introduce herself. She's working with the lake, so she's here. She's got a little 5-minute presentation, and she's wanting to introduce herself.
Great. I'm looking forward to her presentation.
Thank you. And Terry made me promise I would keep this to 5 minutes, so that's what I'm going to do. So my name is Maggie Sullivan. I'm the watershed coordinator for Lake Monroe. I apologize for not sending you a written report. I'm going to do that after this meeting, but just in a snapshot, this is the watershed for Lake Monroe. You'll notice more than half is in Brown County, about 20% in Jackson and 20% in Monroe. A lot of people think Bloomington drains to the lake, but for the most part, it does not. It's mostly the areas east and south of Bloomington that are within the watershed. We have been doing a whole bunch of steps to put together this watershed management plan. The very first one was looking at stakeholder concerns. What are people concerned about with the lake? We had 2 public forums, one in Bloomington in last November and one in Nashville in January. As you might expect, it was a wide variety of comments, but this is sort of a word bubble of things people talked about: E. coli, sedimentation, invasive species, lots of talk about drinking water, as you might imagine, but it was interesting to see what people had to say. We had planned to do a whole lot of public outreach this year, and with the pandemic, we've kind of scaled that back and postponed a lot of things for next year. We are working on getting 30 of these signs marking the boundaries to the Lake Monroe watershed. We have approval to put 9 up in Monroe County, and then I'll be working in Brown and Jackson and Bartholomew as well. Unfortunately, NDOT says we can't put these on state highways, so we're focusing on county roads, but I'm excited about that. Really, we're about 1/3 of the way through a 2-year project, and the bulk of the work so far has been reviewing existing data. So I've been doing what's called a desktop survey, looking at existing reports and GIS data. This map shows the impairments that IDEM has identified in the watershed. There's 3 streams that they've flagged. We've got Little Salt Creek, which starts in the southeast corner of Brown County and flows down into Jackson, is impaired for E. coli. And then Crooked Creek, which flows into the northeast corner of the lake, is also impaired for E. coli. And then the downstream stretch of the South Fork of Salt Creek is impaired for dissolved oxygen and biological integrity. And that biological integrity means they looked at the fish and the macroinvertebrates and they didn't see the diversity that they wanted to see. So they're concerned there's a problem with the stream. And then the lake itself is impaired for taste and odor, algal blooms, and mercury in fish, which we're not addressing as part of this study. I've also been supplementing that with what we call a windshield survey, which is going out. We identified 580 places where a road crosses a stream in the watershed, and I inspected 230 of them and documented what I found, mostly looking at erosion. Is there a riparian buffer, meaning are there healthy plants holding the stream bank into place, or is it mowed directly to the edge? Are there livestock that have access to the stream? Are there any straight pipes flowing into the stream? Any other potential concerns, and also good things that we saw. The next big part that's going on is water quality monitoring. So there's 3 components. The first is tributaries, and this is the IU Limnology Lab doing this. So they're going out monthly. They started in April. They're sampling the North Fork Salt Creek, Middle Fork Salt Creek, and South Fork Salt Creek are the main tributaries that flow into the lake. And then Crooked Creek because of that E. coli concern. And then the tailwaters of the lake. So that'll allow us to model the flow of sediment or nutrients through the lake, what's coming in and what's going out. So we're about halfway through that water sampling process. They also have been sampling Lake Monroe this summer. So they have 3 sample locations, one in the upper basin, one in the middle of the lower basin, and then one down by the dam. And they're sampling those. They were only contracted to do 3 samples, but it looks like they're going to have 6 in total. And they're also doing 2 different depths, since in the summer, the higher level, the warmer water stays separate from the colder water on the bottom. And then the Army Corps of Engineers also samples the lake every year at 2 slightly different spots. So we'll have that data to work with as well. And then we're gearing up. Next week is our watershed sampling blitz. We have about 70 volunteers that'll be going out and sampling 125 places in the watershed. And this, we're trying to get some of the smaller streams and see really where are there issues? Can we start to pinpoint where sediment or E. coli or nutrients are coming from? So the big things we're looking at are E. coli, sediment, and nutrients. And the E. coli, we're especially curious to see if it's human or animal in nature. Sediment carries contaminants, but it also silts in the reservoir over time. And then nutrients contribute to those harmful algal blooms, the blue-green algae warnings that happen in the lake most summers. There's other groups doing sampling as well. Brown County Regional Sewer District is testing for E. coli in a number of streams. They're also doing that source testing to see if it's humans or livestock or wildlife. And then the City of Bloomington Utilities has a storm team that's sampling the South Fork of Salt Creek. This picture down here is that stream gauge that Terry just mentioned that went in January. This photo was taken in late January after a pretty heavy rain. You can see how brown that water is. We know a lot of sediment moves during storm events, and it can be hard to capture just based on a monthly sampling. So they are collecting these additional samples as well. So I feel like we're just getting into the meat of the project right now. This next quarter, we'll be focusing on data analysis. What can we learn from all this data that we've collected? And then trying to start to identify the causes and the sources, where are things coming from, set our goals, develop the action plan that says, how can we get from where we are to where we want to be? Keep building those coalitions of who's going to be involved in actually implementing changes, and then sort of coming back around to our outreach and education, which was put on hold this year. So ultimately, we plan to publish that plan in January 2022. We want to be ready with a coalition of support and funding and move forward with implementation. So I went 1 minute over, I apologize, but that is what's going on in a nutshell, and I will be very happy to answer questions anytime.
Great, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Sullivan?
No, I'm glad she's doing it.
I'm glad to see it being done. It's really important work that's happening there. Is there any public comment on this?
I have a quick question, and I would like to start by saying, and hi Megan, and it's good to see the work. About the mercury, do you know who is doing work on that? Because I know it is an issue of impairment in Indiana broadly in the water, and I know it's not really addressed to 319s, and I know it's not what you're doing, so I'm sorry for the off-topic question. But do you know if that is worked on?
Offhand, I don't know if anyone is working on that. I mean, it is an issue throughout the state, and the main cause is the air pollution, coal power plants, and that sort of thing. And so it's difficult to address. I know there's work being done on that end to try and clean up what's coming out of the stacks and move us towards cleaner energy. Well, not a whole lot's happening in Indiana, but people are trying. But I don't know specifically cleaning up the water if there's anything going on.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, any other questions, comments from the public? From the board?
I have just, I guess, a quick question, and it's not too much of a curveball. We spoke not too long ago. Have you explored any other conservancy area or some type of collaborative measure across municipalities that have been affected? I know I referred you to the Yellow River Kankakee Development Commission. It's a long name, and they've worked with state legislators and identified some ways of getting the funding source to deal with these issues that might present themselves. Mm-hmm. So I know that was a little broad, but I was curious if you've explored any other scenarios.
Well, I think it's worth saying that one of the concerns that's come up repeatedly is that there isn't one entity in charge of the watershed. I mean, we're talking about multiple counties, multiple towns. There is a lot of property that's federally owned and a lot of property that's state owned. So there are a lot of entities involved. And right now our focus is kind of bringing everyone to the table But I have not spent a lot of time looking at structures. There is a separate group that is working to establish a water fund for Lake Monroe, and they're not quite sure what that will look like in terms of whether they want to go the route of approaching the state and having a conservancy or some similar structure put into place, or if it's more they want to be an independent nonprofit that's just focused on funneling money where it needs to go. So I haven't gotten an update from that group recently. There's some people from the Nature Conservancy that are spearheading that. But it's definitely part of the issue that we're looking at is structural. How do you get watershed work done when it crosses all these political boundaries?
Awesome, thank you. I'd be really curious to hear more from the smaller group that's focused on this in the future. Obviously, we're not there yet.
Sounds good.
All right, if there are no further questions or comments, we can move on to a discussion on karst with Dr. Lee Floria.
Yes. I have no prepared comments, but I'm certainly willing to talk about my experiences, answer any questions that you might have, and otherwise go through some elements of your stormwater plan with respect to karst, along with Sarah, who's been working in this for a few years, and just provide you feedback as requested and as needed. So let me just at the outset say that I am originally from a karst area in Somerset, Kentucky, and I have lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which has its own issues, lived in Tampa, Florida, which has its own issues, and lived in Miami, Florida, as well as Columbia, Missouri. So most of my life has been spent in limestone terrains, and it's very nice to see that Bloomington has a karst ordinance with respect to development and stormwater. So that's just to kind of give you a little bit of where I come from. I'm primarily a hydrogeologist. I do some geochemistry, and I do some geomorphology, and have a licensed professional geologist in registration in Kentucky and Indiana. So let me just set the stage for that. And if you have any specific questions, I just want to start by opening it up to you and see if you have like any basic questions about what it is in the framework of karst that is important to consider with respect to designing, engineering structures, and otherwise mitigating stormwater control. And then we can get into some more of the specifics about your plan that you might have.
All right, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Penny.
I wanted to know how static or stable these karst features are, and how often you see enlargements, changes, and also then separate from that is how much underground connection there are between different karst features.
Okay, that's a good question, and we get questions from citizens all the time on this. Sinkholes as an event are something that is of major concern. We see it on the news. Oftentimes when it makes the news, it's a dramatic example. So broadly, the process of karst development, the formation of the landscape, is a very long-term process. The formation of a cave, which is sort of the receiving end of the sediments and water from above, takes a long time to develop. We're talking tens of thousands of years in order to enlarge fractures and bedding planes in the rock big enough to be able to channel and move water through, and therefore the sediments that lay over the surface. So an average sort of circular depression that you might see that we call a sinkhole, that doesn't have like the throats or a sinking stream or a collapse feature, we're talking about, thousands to tens of thousands of years in order for that landscape to denude, in order to change the profile of that sinkhole. And this is in a unaffected landscape, right? So all of that changes when you move into urbanization and agriculture and things that sort of modify that landscape and change the runoff profile, change the sedimentation profile, and other aspects of sort of drainage. And so the collapse features that you see are much more rapid. However, there is some predictability in how and where they might occur. And that a lot of that comes down to soil thickness and soil type. If there's a classic publication from Ann Tahansky, the US Geological Survey, that looked at what's called cover subsidence versus cover collapse. Most of what you see out there is cover subsidence. So these are your golf ball depressions that you see all over the landscape. They're dimple-like, they're relatively shallow in depth and broad and circular in pattern. Those are slow forming features. Cover collapse happens when you have a dropout that occurs. The dropout is often because, number one, the soil has more clay, and the clay binds and holds the soil together so that the sand doesn't hourglass in, sift through, and create that dimple shape. So the clay holds it there longer. And if you have water levels that change up and down frequently, that change in buoyancy can cause instabilities in the soil. So those are other things that cause the landscape to collapse down. Most of what we see in our area are these 1 foot to 10 foot circular dropouts that are a few feet deep. That's most of what we see. And those occur primarily as a result of changing climate. So like spring rainfall, summer drought, and those collapses that are created by that changes in precipitation profile. And so we get phone calls every spring saying, I have a sinkhole that dropped out in my front yard. And that's often what we see. Now, those are typically fairly shallow, but they're connected to something deeper. So that's one big part of it. The second part of your question was, how are these connected? They're all connected into a network that drains to a receiving spring. Now, a sinkhole may drain to a conduit that's only a few inches in diameter or the size of a big cave. And you can't just immediately tell that based upon the sinkhole itself. So, but that water is going somewhere, and it's going to a spring and joining with other tributaries, just like a surface stream network. Does that help you sort of get a frame of reference for how those are connected together?
Lee, this is Terry.
Yes. Yes.
You were talking about the dropout sinkholes.
Yes.
I had several reports of those this year also, 4 or 5 of them. When I'm looking at those, what kind of a buffer is realistic if you're telling me that they're not they're not responding in the same way the settling out sinkholes do? I'm looking at it in the way from the point of view of stabilized footings for structures.
Right. I don't have a number for you, but I'll kind of tell you what I like in terms of how they evolve. Typically, like, you know, if you're see one drop out in a cornfield, you'll have vertical walls of soil, you know, 1 to 10 feet in diameter, and maybe just a few tens of feet tops deep. And so what happens with any sort of vertical collapse in unstable materials like soil is that once that dropout happens, then the soil profile starts working its way back, sort of as a V shape, right? And so you could almost like say, if you go back to the angle of repose of whatever that material might be. So if it's, you know, a 30-degree slope, that's your stable angle of repose, and it's 10 feet deep, well, then you could calculate out the distance that V would look like after it stabilizes.
Okay.
Based upon the depth of the bottom of the dropout, right? So that's one way to do it. That all changes based upon what kind of vegetation you have. So when we get calls, oftentimes I tell people, hey, the sinkhole is there. You can fill it, but that doesn't prevent Mother Nature from having placed something there that wants to form, right? And so there are ways you can modify that, but just dumping soil and rocks in there isn't always a strategy that works long term. And if you cover that up and forget about it, then the next person along the line didn't know something was there. So, you know, in somebody's yard, I tell people, maybe, you know, isolate that area off, give yourself a buffer around it, plant roots, rooted vegetation, trees and stuff to hold the soils in place, and that stabilizes it. Another thing to do is route the drainage away from it, right? Because it's the drainage that created the sort of the situation where the water's going down that exasperates the normal process. The more water you put in there, the faster that process occurs.
Okay. One thing I've tried to rationalize in that the new sinkholes with the steep slopes are, in my mind, new. And as these sinkhole spreads out, I try to visualize that as an older sink, and it may be more stable than this new one. And I hadn't thought about the different soils types, but I would, if I see a sinkhole that's very gentle slopes going down to the eye, that doesn't concern me as much as a sinkhole that's got a 2-to-1 or a 1-to-1 slope down to the sink. I see that as expanding more rapidly and more risk for placing any kind of a structure close to that.
Yeah,
is that reasonable?
Yeah, there's a strong element of truth there. And so like the way that I tell like a farmer, if a farmer has a broad sinkhole and every year they get a spot that drops out, here, this year it's over here, that year it's over there. Well, if you think of it, if you add up those small little dropouts and widenings, drop and widen, if you add them up over a couple hundred years of small ones opening up like that, they accumulate into that broad depression, right? So you have sort of the perimeter, which defines the area where things are draining down. But maybe this year you get a drop over here, and then it widens out, and then the drop occurs over here, and then widens out. And that sort of cumulative effect sort of hourglasses that sediment down slowly. The soil type has a major contributing factor to what that looks like. In Tampa, Florida, where you have really loosely consolidated sand, it literally is almost like an hourglass, sifting down through. In areas where you get clay lenses, what happens is that clay lens prevents that from hourglassing down. And then when the water table gets dropped because of drought or because of water extraction through the pumping, then you lose that buoyancy and boom, it drops down. And that's where you see the ones that appear on TV.
So in trying to figure out what is the sort of that 25, right now we're looking at 25-foot perimeters. We should be also looking at the type of karst that's there, whether it's new or old, whether there's a lot of other sink areas in your golf ball things, whatever.
Yeah, Sarah cued me to let her jump in here.
Yeah, so if I can interject for a moment, part of what's happening and part of, I think, the disconnect and, well, how do you really come up with a number is, as Lee's talking about, you have the soil drainage, and that is really dependent on soil type, but it's connected to the limestone through the epikarst. So it's all the little, I cut his head off. It's all the little conduits that are perhaps centimeters or less that go through the limestone at the base of the soil column. And that's where you have a lot of dissolution happening at that interface between the rock and the soil. But it's much more diffuse than just the sinkhole or just the dimple. And that's where Lee was kind of talking about the perimeter of sinkholes that you have, or the development. Maybe there's a front of development happening in a low-lying area where the water's collecting and draining through the soil. And it's really hard to give a number for how far you should build a buffer zone, because realistically, it's that entire epikarst zone that is taking that water and prone to collapse and further dissolution development. And maybe it's more helpful to put a buffer zone around that section, or if it's too large, maybe it's helpful to put limits on the density of impervious surfaces that are channeling the surface flow. And I don't know really what the most constructive option is there, but it's not just going through the sinkhole that you see. The sinkholes are a result of the drainage flowing through in a more diffuse fashion.
And so if I might add here, from my experience in Tampa, Florida, and there is an entire consulting industry that's been built around detecting sinkholes. And quite honestly, a lot of it is sort of your bunk lawyers who are trying to make money, and then you have your legit geologists and engineers that are trying to actually put forth good information. And so it's always a conflict there. So the typical thing that happens is the insurance company wants to know, is there or is there not a sinkhole? And what they do is they do geophysical exploration. Some of the simplest things you can do is you go in from an invasive technique. You go in with what's called a cone penetrometer, and you do a push test through the soils, and you look for areas where you have low density soil, because the low density soil is an indication of raveling or subsidence into the subsurface. Where you have much more compact soils, maybe that's not the case. And also the vertical profile. If you have sand, 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 clay, sand, 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 then that clay horizon may have a lot to determine what's happening, in terms of the style of sinkhole that happens. From a non-invasive strategy, mapping out a sinkhole using something like electrical resistivity is really good. You can get a good contact between the soil and bedrock interface. Ground penetrating radar works in Florida, does not work here because clay creates dampening effects on the signal coming out of the GPR, and you only get a few feet of penetration at best through those clay-rich soils. So all that's to say is most of what they do in Florida is they go in advance and they do exploration and geophysics to make sure they know what that zone is where you might have an effect. And then they come through and they enact their plans of what their mitigation might be or their buffers might be based upon what they detect. Now, that is also much more expensive, right? And that's also in a landscape that has an enormous legal industry around them, which is not the case in Bloomington, Indiana. So whether it's worthwhile or not, I don't know, but it's a very different kind of landscape there that you're dealing with in legal, but also physical landscape versus here. Like as Sarah said, the number really isn't the key. It's, are you looking at what the indicators are in the field? What is the soil type? What is the vegetation that you have? Are there drainage features coming into it? What is their past experience there? And then if there is, can you calculate back what that profile might look if you get a sinkhole dropout in that?
Another really critical factor in there is, are there known caves in that region that are passing underneath or nearby underneath? Because if that's the case, you're on the main route of one of those underground river conduits.
Which is what we're out sampling today at the Springs.
I have a question. I've discovered that it's common practice to run stormwater into sinkholes, at least around here. Can you comment about that, please?
It's a very common thing all around the United States, and whether it's good or bad depends upon who you ask, right? So there are cases where, let's say that you have a sinking stream and you know that there is a sinking stream that goes into the ground, and you can see a conduit going down to a cave that is already receiving water. If you route water into it properly, it's functioning as that drain. The greatest example in this area I know about is Dog Hill Donahue Cave just south of Bedford, where Highway 37 was built over the entrance, and they built a culvert down at an angle, and the culvert is the entrance to a 4-mile-long cave. So I don't know whether that's whether that's good.
Well,
from the perspective of water quality,
what happens
is different, right?
It might be a good utilization of redirecting water to avoid flooding concerns, but that water that you're routing through the caves has no filtration whatsoever. Right. There's no natural filter like you'd have going through a soil column. And right. So whatever you're putting out there, you have to know is going to come out of a spring in an unfiltered capacity.
Right, that's exactly true. So, the difference between, we can use it as a storm drain, is Bowling Green, Kentucky had a lot of experience with this, and they had hydrocarbon fumes boiling up in basements, and they had to create a Superfund site in downtown to be able to mitigate that because they routed all their stormwater drains into underlying caves. So that's not necessarily good from a water quality perspective. Now, what you'll see in sort of the more modern sort of utilization of sinkholes as these stormwater drains is they put like a Class 5 injection well. And the Class 5 injection well is usually shallow. It doesn't typically go into a conduit, or it shouldn't. That's the idea, is it shouldn't go straight into a conduit. But they will they will re-excavate and modify the existing sinkhole with a flat floor, put a standpipe down into a depth that will be able to accommodate the flow and diffuse it out into the surrounding rock. The stormwater runoff from the road will fill it, create a stilling well, which will pour over the standpipe at a certain flow regime, below which it just enters that and then percolates through the bottom. And they did a lot of that on Highway 37. And that's a fairly accepted practice now that has some filtration to be able to get rid of at least the particulate matter. It doesn't get rid of all the dissolved matter, but it gets rid of particulate matter. And then the overflow and the stilling well helps moderate the flood pulse, which is good, because getting rid of the flood pulse is the important part there, so you don't overwhelm the system and create other effects downstream.
I just wanted to add on to that real quick. Sorry, Julie. I guess, could you, go into the fact that using sinkholes as like a drainage, you don't get exposure to sunlight, which can kill organic chemicals as well, I guess, or
So I'll comment just briefly. Bacterial loading in caves is a big problem. I know the Bowling Green Mammoth Cave area has been doing research in it, and they have detected significant amounts of antibiotic-resistant bacteria living in the water in the caves. That was more recent work in the past couple of years, and no one, to my knowledge, is doing that kind of work in southern Indiana because it's expensive and hard to sample for. But it's definitely a possibility, and it's just really hard to monitor. So that's something that you have to realize is a possibility, and it's a scary one, and you might not be able to catch it before something bad happens. So it's going downstream into the springs. So you don't know, and you can't see the conduit. So you don't know whose well is pulling from it. You don't know exactly what's going to happen on that pathway because it's obscured by the surface.
Of course, that's unless you can explore the cave, which we also do, but that's not always possible because water can fit through things that we can't. Now, from the perspective of more traditional contaminants, like your hydrocarbons, there are two major types. You have your what's called L-naples, which are your light phase, things like gasoline that will float on water. And then you have your D-naples, and right now I can't think of an example in my head, but that sink in the water column. Both of those present challenges in terms of being able to manage a spill risk. So if you have a stormwater injection well, for example, next to a gas station, and the gas station has a spill event, and that water spills into the sinkhole, and then you get a pulse in there, most of that is going to be an L-napple phase, which if it gets into these conduits will tend to float and stick to the ceilings of whatever it is. What that means is twofold. One is you have to know where that water's going. So things like dye traces are very important, or some other means of tracing that water pathway is very important. Number two is then getting an estimate of the time of travel. How long will it take to get somewhere? That can also be done with the dye trace and some other mechanisms. But basically, if you need to know what your timing is so that if a tanker truck overspills, which happened on I-65 more than once in Mammoth Cave area, if that overspills and 50,000 gallons of gasoline spill out, how long do you have to be able to get to a point to where you can mitigate that and siphon it off before it gets into the Mammoth Cave proper, or get to the spring to capture it before it flows out into the Green River? That's really important. The other thing to know, specifically with D-naples, is that you may see that pulse come through and then it'll trail off and think, oh, well, the contaminant's gone now. That's not true. Every time you have a flood event, you're going to see sediment stirred up, and you're going to get another pulse of that come through time. Things like PCBs, actually, that's a good example of a D-napple. And so thinking about that, in terms of a longevity and how to be able to mitigate that at the time of spill is very important when thinking about stormwater.
Lee? Go ahead, Julie.
So I have some questions that are sort of interrelated. So if I could just throw them all at you at once, that would be great. So over time, we have maps from 100 years ago that show sinkholes in the county, and we have LIDAR now, where we can detect, right, where the sinkholes are, even if they're not evident, right? There's no actual hole, but there's definitely a sloping, right? And we're very small on those gradients of what we can look at, which is great. But so first question is, how important is it to understand the change over time in these karst features, in these sinkholes? Second, you've addressed this somewhat, but I have a lot of concerns because I'm just going to throw an example at you so you kind of get a sense of where we're at. We recently had a development come through, and they're on 2 properties. So in the span of a couple, 3 acres, there are 4 sinkholes. Plus, on the north side of the property, acres away, there's another one. And I'm like, they're got to be connected, right? So how can we, is it just a matter of putting in place, having a geologist, or is there something where we can require a developer? What do we look for first to say you're required to do it? And then what do we ask them for? Thanks.
That's a fair question. And so a couple of angles here. Number one, you mentioned LIDAR. I would refer you to, and this is not, to point at me, but I helped do some work in Florida with Pinellas County, where they did a lot of LIDAR testing to see how you could use LIDAR to detect sinkholes. The big conclusion there is it's a big maybe, right? And what I mean by that is that you can very clearly detect a depression, but it really takes concurrent aerial photography and ground truthing to be able to very clearly say, yes, this is a sinkhole. And I know there's a Junfeng Zhu at the Kentucky Geological Survey is trying to work on artificial intelligence methods of doing the same thing. But until you get that right, you're just detecting a depression. That's not a genetic thing. That's just a feature. So then what we saw is that when you're in an urban landscape, it's almost impossible to be able to back out what are depressions and what are things like swimming pools, skylights in the tops of houses, reflections, anomalous readings, things that just come out of urbanizing a landscape. And so your detection rate goes down to less than 30% in an urban landscape. That's just sort of LIDAR. Now, understanding how things change through time is really cool thought that we put a proposal in last year to look at. We have LIDAR from, I think it was 2012, and we have LIDAR that's coming out now. Can you take and look at those two and overlay them and see if you can find hot spots where the landscape has denuded down, or you see this happen here? And what is the density of that hot spot change, right? That's, I think, an area of work that can be done. Nobody's done it yet to my knowledge, but man, it would be cool really to put somebody on that, do your overlays and see if you can come out with the density of hot spots to know, like, what's the frequency of change per square kilometer. That would be really cool. So that's one thing in terms of the research. Now, related to that, and I'm sorry, you got your second part of your question was about like the number of sinkholes and how they're connected and who we put on that job to help understand that. So, I mean, I'm a geologist. I'd say, yeah, licensed professional geologist. Make sure you have one on all of these to go and do that. Now, the problem is that truly and realistically in Indiana, you have, I think, because I'm on the board, there's like 1,400 registered professional geologists. Of those, you have probably a subset that are environmental geologists, of which are a subset that know anything about karst, of which are a subset that really do anything with sinkholes. And if you look in Monroe County, it's pretty much me and maybe the people at Hydro Inc. and Jerry Lewis, right? So it's a really small group of people who do this work, and we all have very different trainings. So I come at it as a caver. I have a physics background. I'm a hydrologist. I work and teach at a university. Hydrology Inc. They're consultants. They do dye tracing. They do a lot of phase 1, phase 2 assessments for NEPA contracting. And Jerry Lewis does the same, but his background is in biology. So he does a lot of Endangered Species Act work. So we all come at it through different lenses. I won't say that I'm the closest, because honestly, I don't do a lot of this sinkhole investigation work on my own as a consultant. But broadly speaking, when you're talking about people who are qualified to do the geophysics, to look at the geology, the soils, the hydro data, and understand that, you're talking about maybe people you can count on your hand in Monroe County that really have that technical background to do that. I mean, that's my gut instinct on that. Now, with that said, this is not to muster any sort of business of any kind. I do think that it's important to make sure to ask those questions, particularly for large developments. Somebody wants to put a house in, you've got a zoning, permitting, you go through that. At some level, it's on the landowner to make sure that their foundation holds, right? And so like some of that's put on the landowner to do their due diligence with that. But if a big industry comes in or a housing development comes in, that's a very different question. And I would encourage you to make sure to have somebody on each of those major things that come through who can really assess that for what's happening. And that doesn't have to be somebody in Monroe County. That just needs to be somebody who has that experience looking at large scale development and the impacts that might have on the landscape and the groundwater and caves and karst.
Any further questions?
Thanks for that,
Quickly,
Lee. That was a good eye opener. Sorry, Tron.
oh, no, you're absolutely fine. So working with the Surveyor Association, they've talked about using LiDAR to develop watersheds quickly and things. I think that's a practical good use for LiDAR. The fact is there's still a lot of uncertainty built into LiDAR, and that we do have the new 2019s. It would be really cool to kind of look at some of the study to see what kind of erosion has occurred. But not to really get in that, I want to say is we experience here locally an issue with using LiDAR to kind of make decisions. And fortunately enough, we contract out our project with some good workers, and they were able to make a judgment call on the field. But my point being is we have like 2 feet of uncertainty pretty much built into that. So if you're looking at a way that water's going to flow and stuff, that's going to be very crucial to make sure you know exactly what kind of topographic layout that you have. And the way that LiDAR works, it reflects back. So, they may not be getting the ground. So there's a lot of uncertainty built into LiDAR. I definitely think it's a tool that can help us, especially when we're looking at watersheds and maybe even trying to get a better idea of what's in our county. Just so as we are developing those areas, maybe we can use that to trigger some type of geotech type thing. It definitely could help in our more sensitive areas. And I did have one question with kind of the karst inventory. Has that stopped being collected more or less? I mean, we got 2011 and we don't do anything here locally to collect our data, even though that you might see a bunch of surveys and surveyors are calling this, a sinkhole or a conservancy area, and they're showing closed contours and stuff. I think some surveyors are hesitant to actually identify as a sinkhole, but they put in a conservation area or conservancy area and move forward. So 2 things. One was the question, are you still collecting that inventory? And 2 is we need to do a better job here locally why the professionals are providing us documents just so we can kind of track it. So when we look at a map and we're potentially developing a new area of the county, we're like, oh, hey, we have 4 sinkholes here. Because when they become just a piece of paper, they become somewhat static and get filed away. We're not necessarily accessing that information as we need it. And it could just disappear too.
Yeah. My battery just said it's dying. I am so sorry. And that's the thing when you're out doing remote field work. So if I cut off, that's what's happened. I can maybe try to pull that back up on my phone. The answer to your question is yes, there are people collecting data all the time. Now, the static layers that you see on like Indiana map, those are static because they were snapshots of what people had done, right? So with regards to sinkholes, a sinkhole map had been made years and years ago, but that sinkhole map was really pretty, well, it was based upon topographic lines and centroids of sinkholes. I was involved in work in Kentucky that did something very similar. I think that you can use the LiDAR to do a much better job, at least to get an idea of what the distribution is, and then you have to do all your field testing to see if it's a sinkhole or just a depression. So we can certainly do a better job there. With regards to like springs, we really just don't have as much information as we should, and that's what we're actually out doing today, is visiting springs and doing water chemistry and trying to get good locates. And we've just developed the Springs app so that we can add more data to that in the future. From the perspective of caves, that is another discussion for another day, because there's a lot in there in terms of like propriety, understanding Section 106 for Archaeology and Endangered Species Act, because there's a lot of making sure that that information doesn't get public, that comes into those layers. But there is the Indiana Cave Survey, which has been collecting that data and continues to collect that data, and we're both involved in that at a level. So yes, if there is an example of, hey, we know that there's something here, can you tell us? Get in touch with us, because we have the tendrils in to be able to find out if there's more information than what you might see like on Indiana map. It's likely that there is, because Monroe County's been crawling with cavers since the 1940s. Right? So just ask. Now, whether we can update that and put it online more, that's going to be more challenging just because of the sensitivity of those data. So with that said, I'll leave it there so that I don't run out of battery anymore. If you had any other questions real quick.
I actually have one question that may not be quick, but let's see what you can have time to do with it. In an ideal world, what kind of development would you want to see around sinkholes, or possibly none at all?
Yeah, it's a very, I mean, I can be trite and say none, right? You know, but like,
yeah,
we have set up a situation in the central United States by which we founded towns in limestone terrains around springs, because those were the sites where water was available and there is no surface streams available elsewhere. That's why the towns like Lexington, Bloomington, all of these towns are around springs, right? Now, moving forward, how do you manage that? Well, one is making sure that you address density. Density is critical, like how much you allow per acre in terms of impervious surface. That's critical, whether that's a rooftop or a parking lot. Two is when you have an impervious surface, think about pervious impervious surfaces, these new concrete styles and buffers and gutters that allow infiltration rather than just straight to a class 5 injection well. That's also very important. A third thing is making sure you have good riparian buffers on all of your sinking streams and sinkhole drains and the things that you're talking about in terms of perimeters around these sinkhole features. All of those things really help, not just the hydro period that you're looking at in something like Clear Creek, you know, that receives spring water, how flashy that is, because that translates to flood risk. The other is the quality of water that comes out of those springs too, because if you add filter berms, these pervious concretes and things like that, that's really going to help do that filtration through the soil column into the groundwater environment. So those things are really key if you're talking about urbanization long term. I think Bloomington does a heck of a much better job, because you actually do have an ordinance, whereas where I grew up in Somerset, Kentucky, that is even more karsty than here, doesn't have anything, and zero planning and zoning, right? So you're in light speed ahead of where they are, and they are more typical for the central United States. So, you know, kudos that you're actually forward thinking there. But moving forward, you know, those are some things to add to it. to think about to help create some critical infrastructure.
And if I can interject here, and it's something that I think that Tron was really hitting on very well, is that the one thing that all karst drains have in common is that they are all very different. They are all very heterogeneous environments, and the water does not drain the same in southern Indiana as it does in central Kentucky, as it does in Florida, as it does in the Edwards Aquifer in Texas. It just doesn't behave the same. And what's really cool, as a county or a city, you can actually understand the watersheds that you're dealing with in detail and design ordinances that can address the needs of that watershed based off of their flood response pattern and where they drain to, how long the system is, how many sinkholes do you have per underground drainage mile. Whereas you can't do that on a state or federal level. So really the power to manage that correctly is with you. And perhaps we don't have all the data that we need to answer those questions or come up with those numbers, but it's definitely attainable. And this is the level that it needs to be happening at. So as Lee said, it's great. And I know we were both really happy when we heard that you were all working on this and wanted to keep working on it.
Very good. Tron, did I see you raise your hand?
I was saying bye. It's 4 o'clock, so I get to stay, and I'm saying bye to everyone that gets to leave.
Oh, okay.
Well, this is Margaret Clements, and I'm dialing in by telephone, and I serve on the Plan Commission, and I have a question about, the number of complex sinkholes in a given acre. Like, how much housing should we allow to be built on such a site?
There's not a good answer there.
It relates back to how flashy the system is, how much it drains to that place and how much drains from that place. And there are no numbers. Those are numbers that have to be developed.
So from the perspective of Florida, there is something called a DRI, which is a development of regional impact. And historically that used to be when you had 2,000 structures. So like these big, villages style communities that were being built in Central Florida. Whenever you achieved more than 2,000, you had to do a development of regional impact assessment for the state of Florida and the water management districts, because that was where they said the threshold was arbitrary, I think, but that's where their threshold was, above which they realized that wasn't going to be just a local influence, that they had to look at it on a regional impact level. So I guess, although I don't have a number for you, one thing to think of is, can you internally think, man, if we have a house being built, that's one thing. But if we have somebody wanting to come in and develop a community and build, 100 homes or a subdivision or whatever it might be, maybe that's when it triggers a sort of a regional assessment on what that does to the entire watershed versus what it does to the footprint of the development, right? And that might be a better way to look at it. And like I said, I can't give you a number, and it might be subjective at best, right?
That is very helpful. I think the idea of coming up with and developing a regional impact model in implementing that into our ordinance would be something very productive to do.
I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah. And in some level, that sort of falls in line and is modeled after the EPA 319 program, sort of understanding what the regional effect is and trying to develop strategies to work with landowners to help mitigate those at the head of it rather than at the end of the stream. And so similar idea, but in your case, it would be through permitting and regulations versus giving people money to plant riparian buffers, right?
Well, and it's really, as far as stormwater goes, it's really quite striking as opposed to the 319, where it focuses mostly on water quality, how much, when you're in a karst landscape, changes upstream or up drainage from a spring change the flood response of that system. It's really incredible.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank
Any
you.
further questions?
Just a thank you.
Are there any further questions about the battery?
Yeah, thanks very much for allowing us to jump in here sort of in the middle of our field day. Looks like the battery's timed perfectly here. I appreciate it very much. we are most certainly able to, email, talk more about this as you need, because I know that it's going to be a longer term thing rather than just going home and writing it up. Sometimes these take years to get them written the way you want them to look. So just let us know how we can help. We're right in downtown at the survey, and we're more than happy to chat about this in the future.
Lee, I have a question for you. This is Terry.
Yes.
I just heard an offer to answer additional questions. Would you rather I encourage the people here to send you questions, or I can gather questions up and send them to you in groups, if that's a little more?
Either one's fine. Just given the world we live in and the work that we're doing, just expect a day or two before we can get back, because sometimes the responses will require some thought, right? Not just a quick yes or no. So we may have to send, look up and send you some.
Very well. Like the conversation is over.
I guess so. Very informative. All right, next up, we have the stormwater fee. And I guess
Quickly, before we move forward, I know the presenter isn't here, but we were looking at something on our previous drainage board, and he alluded to that there might be some more information at the state level that they have compiled. Just kind of a thought there, Terry, to reach out and see if they have anything that pertains to that development that you're kind of looking at closely right now through the drainage board. Could maybe be helpful. So.
All right, are we ready to move on? Okay, the next thing up is the stormwater fee, and I think I need a motion for that.
Lee, I want you to know that David is not here today, so if there are any questions about it, I'm not sure we can get an answer for you.
Oh.
I don't have any legal questions, but I'll go ahead and move. I mean, I guess I've not really ever moved anything forward. I'd like to, do we entertain it, or do I move it forward for approval and then we entertain it? Sorry, I'm a little lost right there.
I suspect that since David's not available and we can't ask more technical questions of him, we probably want to postpone this discussion for our next meeting. Does that make sense, Terry? Terry?
Excuse me, I was muted.
Oh.
That's up to the board, Lee. I just wanted to.
Well, and
If you all have looked at it and you're comfortable with it, and possibly talk to Dave.
I think Julie has something to say, so does Penny.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just, we had sent the folks away with some more information that we wanted, and I haven't seen that yet. Yeah, I need to give this more thought. I know it's got a lot of steps to go through, but I'd like to wait another month at least if we could.
And I think I want to reiterate, I don't think this is to raise the fee. This was just amending the original of taking away that 3% cap. It's not raising the fee. And this was the first step of that.
Well,
right, but doesn't eliminating the cap raise the fee for some folks?
No, not at this point. We're not proposing any fee increase at this point. I think that's a totally separate ordinance.
Okay, I don't understand then why we're doing this. I had no idea this was coming, and yeah,
I think before Dave left, that's fine, and we can table it. I just remember before Dave left, he sent us 2 ordinances. One was just amending to take away that 3% cap from 2012. The other one we have not presented or sent out or anything.
Okay.
Right, Dave did send some emails out that kind of walk us through this. Like I said, I didn't have legal questions. I definitely am fine with waiting. That is one of my concerns with the pace that we're moving.
it's
So-
not going to have an impact to weight, correct?
No.
Okay, let's just,
No.
I just assume these would be done together, and I don't know why we're doing one without the, I mean, you know what I'm saying? I guess that's my concern, is I don't really understand why we're doing these separately, and if there's no impact on anything we're doing now project-wise,
Yeah, we can wait. Absolutely.
It's fine.
Then I would like to, well, I did have one question, but I don't know if we're officially allowed to talk about this. But I'll just move to table it, and then I'll give you a call later this week, Terry, to see if you can answer my question.
we don't need to table it. We don't need to table it. We haven't had a second.
Well,
So,
it's not even out there, so
yeah, it's just
how do we do that? Do we just
nothing. Don't have to do
nothing?
it.
And then you just put it back on next month's agenda or whenever we're looking at everything. Great, then I guess we're to adjournment, huh?
Yes, I believe that was our last order of business, so we are now adjourned.